intent this evening is really just to listen. I'm quite interested in hearing what all of the ERC members have to say about the EIS, but I don't plan to weigh in with my own opinion. As you know, this matter will be before council before too long, and I just think it's best if I reserve my comments until that time when it's formally a part of council's business. So I'm listening and I'm interested, but I won't be butting in. And just while I have the opportunity, thank you all for taking this on as volunteers. I've looked at the paperwork and gone through it, and you've got a lot of work here. Huge job to review all of this paperwork. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So I guess we'll call the meeting to order. It's just after 5 o'clock. And as you all know, the meeting is being live streamed, and it will be live streamed until the committee goes into camera to discuss the EIS in specific terms. And when we go into camera, the live stream will be stopped, and we won't be returning to the live stream, but draft minutes will be available within 3 working days of the meeting. And so I see that Laurie's just put the agenda up on the screen for everybody to see. Does anybody have any changes, additions, or deletions to the agenda? Okay, then if I could get a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll move to approve.
Thanks, Rick. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, the motion is carried. And I'd like to welcome those attending on the live stream, and you would care to introduce yourselves and maybe explain maybe your interests in this item that we're discussing today. I don't hear anything. Laurie, is there a way to unmute anybody?
Let me just see. Everyone should be unmuted.
I think Jessica has unmuted herself, didn't she?
Yes. Jessica, I think you do need to unmute. There we go.
Hi. Okay. So my name is Jessica Carpat. I'm with Three Sisters Mountain Village. I have done the planning work for the 2 ASPs. Today, you're looking at the EIS for the Three Sisters Village Area Structure Plan.
Okay, anybody else would like to introduce themselves?
Sure, I can jump in. My name's Kyle Knopf. I'm with Golder Associates, and I'm a wildlife biologist who helped to develop the EIS prepared for the Three Sisters Village Area Structure Plan.
Great, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Kopak. I'm with MSCS in Calgary, and we were the third-party reviewers for the EIS on behalf of the town.
Thanks, Brian. Do any of the members of the committee have any questions they would like to ask these 3 people before we discuss things in more detail? I have a couple of questions, and I don't know who to direct them to, but whoever feels they can respond to the best, please do. Reviewing the document, there's a couple of things that came to my attention that I thought needed either explanations or further definition. Number one for me was on the wildlife section, we looked at a number of different species, but notably black bears were missing from the study. And I'm just curious as to why that would be, considering that I think the town has more wildlife interactions with black bears than with any of the other species that were identified.
Sure, I can perhaps start to answer that question for you. So black bears were not included as a valued component in the assessment. Instead, grizzly bears were the focus. But there's a lot of similarities between black bears and grizzly bears in terms of some of the issues that are faced. And we did present quite a bit of information about black bears in the EIS, including providing information on where they were recorded at remote camera stations, evaluating number of conflicts, and pointing to many of the same mitigation actions that would be undertaken for grizzly bears as being important and effective with respect to black bears. But they were not included as a valued component in the terms of reference for the project.
What about other species? And the other one that comes to mind are coyotes.
Yeah, we didn't take an in-depth look at coyotes just because of their, conservation status, and they tend to do fairly well around people, although there are still, many of the same issues that we've identified in terms of potential conflict would also apply to coyotes. And again, many of those mitigations, especially attractant management, fencing, would be important for coyotes. They are much less sensitive to human behavior in terms of their responses, and so more like elk in the sense that they probably would not require as much mitigation as some of the other species to maintain movement, but still important for some of the mitigations that are applied to manage conflict would be important for coyotes as well.
Okay, thank you. And then the other issue I have questions on is the fence. It seems to be that's one of the primary concepts for controlling wildlife for this development, and yet it seems it's very poorly defined on the maps in terms of where it's going to tie into, or how. It's basically an open-ended linear feature at this point that I could see. There's no discussion on, apart from a gated access to the wildlife corridor to the south, there's no mention on how it's going to control wildlife along Three Sisters Parkway, or how vehicular access is going to be managed to prevent wildlife access coming in from the north side. Could anybody explain the reasoning or why that information doesn't seem to be fully developed?
So maybe I'd ask you to clarify the question. So there are figures in the EIS that show the intended location of the fence. Are you talking about the gap in the fence for Three Sisters Village that's on the north side there, running along the river?
Well, maybe I missed it, but I only saw the fence running along the along Valley Wildlife Corridor. I did not see it encircling development.
No, it does encircle the development down to the Bow River. There is a for the Three Sisters Village application, there is currently a gap in the fence that runs along that north side, right along the river there. So we didn't fully enclose the development there, but the river is in that location, and it is one of the sort of key uncertainties that we've identified in the EIS and pointed to the monitoring and adaptive management plan as an important component there to ensure that the fence works as anticipated, and that if it doesn't, like one of our uncertainties is that gap and whether wildlife might be able to come in through that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that for the, for that being a primary control in fact or feature for this development, I just did not find it was well presented in the EIS. I guess the other question I did have was how are vehicles going to be gaining access to the development while preventing wildlife from getting through those openings?
Yeah, so there's several options there, including various kinds of You can have cattle guards, you can have electromatting. There's a whole bunch of different options. And at the EIS stage, we hadn't gotten down to the detail of determining exactly, how that would play out for each crossing. At the EIS stage, well, more specifically at the ASP stage, a lot of that information is still quite high level in terms of what the development will look like in those specific areas. And so we didn't have the detail to get down to the specifics. But the intention is that some form of prevention would occur at those locations where vehicles would come in and there would need to be a space in the fence.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from any of the other members of the committee?
Yeah, Bob,
Go ahead.
I just have a general question about greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I recognize that greenhouse gas emissions were not part of the terms of reference. The fund was not required to address them, but the terms of reference were, I think, finalized in September of 2018. I'm assuming the environmental impact statement was drafted mostly throughout 2019, early 2020. The town adopted its climate action plan in December of 2018, just a couple of months after the terms of reference were approved. And in that climate action plan, it was suggested that greenhouse gas emissions and the control of greenhouse gas emissions should be part of every significant aspect of Canmore's planning processes. So my question is, and it's maybe really for anybody who wants to tackle it, Jessica or Kyle or Josh, during the process of developing the EIS, was any consideration given to including greenhouse gas emissions as part of the statement? Were there any discussions along those lines?
So I can start maybe just with respect to the EIS, and then Jess, maybe you can talk about how climate change is integrated into the ASP. But yeah, the EIS, the terms of reference, did not require a specific study of greenhouse gas emissions, but the EIS does consider climate change as part of the cumulative effects assessment for each of the species. And so we did consider greenhouse gases as they contribute broadly to climate change, but we didn't undertake any specific analyses with respect to the project.
So I can just continue on the GHG emissions question. The area structure plan does consider GHG emissions, and through the direction of the Canmore Action Plan on Climate Change, we are seeking to primarily reduce GHG through both transportation reductions, which is one of the major contributors. We're looking to place uses between close to live, work, and play in order to encourage alternative mobility solutions. Is this coming through okay?
I can hear okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And also, we are working to encourage through incentivization a number of different ways in which to reduce GHG footprint within Canmore. Some of those are, solar panels or alternative energy use, micro generation. We also have a policy within the area structure plan to ensure that buildings are solar ready or encouraged to be solar ready. We also have EV charging incentives for that. So there is a lot of policies to make sure that we are aligned to the climate change action plan. One of the things that I should note, though, is that the Canmore's land use bylaw already regulates, the sustainability of new buildings. And through the land use bylaw, there is regulation that mandates beyond the Alberta Building Code for energy efficient buildings. And that's a town-wide policy. The incentivization within the area structure plan actually tries to stay ahead of the step code that is eventually going to come in through the federal government into Alberta to get towards net zero ready buildings. And that incentivization will help us stay a step ahead of the net zero.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I have looked at those aspects of the area structure plan that do relate to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think when it comes time for citizens of Canmore to comment on the area structure plan, there'll be probably a good discussion around whether those measures are adequate or not. I recognize tonight we're just looking at the environmental impact statement. So I don't want to lead us off into a discussion of the ASP in general. But my question was really just whether consideration was given at the time of the drafting of the EIS that maybe greenhouse gas emissions should be included as part of the environmental impact statement. I think what I'm hearing was, I'm not sure what I'm hearing, it wasn't really discussed, or whether you discussed it and decided it wasn't appropriate to put it in the EIS.
I believe Kyle said that it was discussed in the cumulative impact assessment with regards to the species.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, one aspect of greenhouse gas emissions is the impact of climate change on species and on the project, but the other aspect is the impact of the project on greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that latter part, it sounds like was not really considered at all in thinking about the contents of the EIS. Is that correct?
That is correct. They were outside of the terms of reference and we did not consider including them.
Right. Okay.
So the town currently is reviewing the draft ASPs, both for Smith Creek and Sisters Village, and we will be commenting accordingly to what's being proposed as it relates to our climate action plan. But Kyle is correct. There wasn't an approach to rework the terms of reference, which I think took place before my tenure, but I think that took a good year and a half to get in place. So I think that it was viewed as let's address these concerns in another way, and we're doing that currently through the IS directly, or sorry, the ASPs directly.
Okay, thank you.
Karina or Ralph or Sari, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question with regard to the age of the wildlife movement data. A lot of it is nearly a decade old, and so the question, there's multiple questions to that regard, is maybe just one to start an understanding of why there isn't any newer data, the hurdles of getting any newer data, and then your view also on the validity and the the quality of the cumulative impact assessment if it is based on data that age, because it basically doesn't account for any more recent developments that have occurred within the region, but also specifically in this area.
That's a great series of questions. So there's a whole bunch to unpack there. And I'll start with the age of the data. So the data are mixed in age. A lot of the radio telemetry data, the GPS telemetry data that are available are indeed older, a decade or more in some cases. What we did with those data, though, was to build resource selection function models that are based on the landscape as it was when the data were collected. So we generated responses of wildlife to disturbance on the landscape at that time, and then projected those models forward in time to the landscape as it is now. So we are accounting for some of the new disturbances that have occurred on the landscape within those models. In addition, there are data that are available within our local study area that are much broader in their time span and extend right up to just a couple of years ago. And so those are mostly remote camera data, but also some snow tracking data. And those were considered as well in the EIS. Radio telemetry data are extremely valuable data, but they are expensive to collect, time consuming to collect, and generally require collaborative effort between often academic institutions, the government, and sometimes other parties as well. So those are some of the hurdles, I suppose, in obtaining those data. And so we don't have more recent radio telemetry data. And I'll let maybe Brian speak as well to some of their recommendations in that regard, because I know EMSA's had things to say there.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I mean, I think from our report, I mean, it's sort of a double-edged sword because, like Kyle said, it's difficult to collect some of that data, and I recognize that. And I mean, we were involved in a similar project in this same area 7 years ago, and that was one of the recommendations that we had then, was that sort of focused specific movement data was needed, because there isn't a real good idea. Are animals, you know, entering the corridor on one side and exiting on the other side? How often do they do that? You know, and now when we've seen this EIS, like, I think it's a bit of a combination of, you know, none of that data has been collected in 7 years. And so, you know, Golder's still working with sort of relatively the same set of information and doing the best they can with RSF models and other sort of peripheral analyses, but it still does not get really at the movement question per se, in the way that sort of it seems like people are interested in. And so there's still a lot of inferences that need to be made. And so, and then there's this other piece that we pointed out in our review that we're concerned with is, you know, to sort of top it off, there's a lack of sort of information on sort of differences in change over time. So you don't really have a sense of like how many bears used it in 2005 and how many bears used it in 2018. Has that changed? And how does that relate to human use? You know, it's a complex sort of thing to try and unravel, and unfortunately sort of the data that's needed isn't there and hasn't really been collected yet. For all the reasons Kyle said. I mean, it's a government academic exercise often, right?
And I really strongly agree with Brian's points about some aspects of change over time. The only thing from sort of our perspective that I'd highlight is many of those inferences that can be made from the available data, recognizing that they're older, but we do have quite a bit of telemetry data, and we do have camera data and snow tracking data. And when you combine those, there are some pretty strong inferences that can be made. And in many ways, this is, although perhaps not as recently studied, it is a well-studied system relative to other similar places. And so we have relatively strong data sets from which to make our inferences.
Okay, thank you. Just one follow-up question. So could you please confirm from my review of the EIS, significant focus with regards to those data sets and the cumulative effect assessment was based on the project study area as well as the local study area, while the EIS also considered the regional study area, which is part of the TOR requirement. Would you say an enhancement could be made in the cumulative effect assessment to be placing a bit more emphasis on the knowledge that is has been gathered in the overall regional study area, or would you say that the benefit from broadening the area for those in-depth modeling and measurements would not warrant the associated effort?
So the cumulative effects assessment focused actually at that regional study area scale. So we were incorporating available information from across our RSA, which extends from Exshaw over to the Banff border and encompasses the Bow Valley in between. And so we did incorporate all the available data into those assessments and came to the conclusion in many cases that, you know, there is a serious risk cumulatively for some of these species in the Bow Valley when we consider all of those data together. So maybe I'm not entirely sure, is your question that we should collect additional data to run at that scale? I mean, is that what you're, I'm not quite sure maybe.
Yeah, no, I acknowledge that you have included that data. It was most maps and showed the effects of what it had, the effect is associated with regard to that project. While as you're saying, like the data comes from the broader region and set, and so there is an overall impact on the regions, not just on the project area. So just based on the mapping that was included in the AIS, there is a significant focus on the local study area, which is understandable. It was just the question, like, and maybe that's more for the town's benefit, because there's the whole development that's going on overarching in the town. There's a significant management plan that has to be established, and so that just doesn't affect one project, it impacts a lot of them, and so there's these cumulative effects, but also the cumulative response measurement requirements. And so I guess my question is more broader than that. Outside of these EISs, could this data be used to have a more, I want to say, could inform a regional wildlife strategy plan going forward?
I would say yes in answer to that question. Yeah, those broader data would help.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I have one more question. Sorry, I have to. I'm taking notes at the same time as skipping through my notes. I'm sorry for going back and forth. Hang on. Maybe I'll let somebody else speak before I get back to.
I can go. I hope you can hear me. Reading about MSES's third-party review, it talks about how it's really critical to have really well-structured follow-up programs, robust and meaningful management action in the future in the case that, let's say, some of the targeted goals are not met, whether they are GHG emissions or wildlife consequences. Of course, with these proposals, there has to be assumptions, and there's a lot of uncertainty involved. And just wondering from anybody, if those targets are, let's say, not met within a year or two, or even 5 or 10 years down the road, what are some things that are being proposed?
Sure, I can take a first crack at that, answering that question too, and then Brian, if you have anything to add, you can jump in. But I think the main proposal within the EIS is to have a monitoring and adaptive management plan moving forward. And the specifics of that have not yet been worked out. The commitment is to work those out prior to development moving forward at its next phases. So that's something that still has to happen in terms of setting those bars, in terms of which targets are being put forward and which actions would be undertaken. So that's something that has to be worked out, but it is something that we think is a very important part of the next steps of the project. So it's kind of a critical piece moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things we struggled with when we reviewed the EIS, was just trying to wrap our heads around sort of what level of detail is needed at the ASP stage versus the kind of detail we'd like to see on follow-up programs to try and get at some of these critical questions, because there's a whole pile of them. And the EIS, I mean, does a reasonable job of pointing out the uncertainty and is mostly open to being flexible to sort of incorporate targets and thresholds down the road. Like the fence is kind of biggest thing that ends up getting sort of set in stone. There doesn't seem to be a lot of flexibility in managing the fence down the road, whether it's effective or not, or moving it, or is there, you know, presence absence of the fence or final location. That seems to not be one of the sort of options for this follow-up planning. And I think, you know, I get it. There's different sort of levels of detail at different planning stages. But I think also it's important to be aware that, like, I think the kinds of detail that are going to be needed to define what your monitoring targets are going to be and what your thresholds are going to be really difficult. And they go back to that sort of original question about where's the movement data and how hard that is to gather. I mean, that's the kind, and it hasn't really been gathered except for that telemetry data sort of 10 or 12 years ago. There's going to be some serious thought and effort needed to go into collaring animals to see how often they're using the corridors and how their behavior is changing, because there's also other sort of run-on potential effects that we pointed out. It's not just, you know, if they build a fence around this development, will movement in the corridor be maintained? But we also raised the question sort of will it displace interactions into other parts of town? Because right now there's a lot of elk use the golf course, and where will those elk go? Potentially, at least it's something to think about, and it's something that needs to be followed up on in the follow-up plans. And so there's a lot of really significant detail and work and effort that would be required to sort of get at some of this.
Thank you.
And this was tied to my question as well, and maybe so this is more of a question for Josh and Laurie. Kind of what is the town's expectations or plans to manage this conceptual stage and moving this on to the next process of having a clear plan on setting expectations and what is acceptable in the next step, so that I don't want to be ultimately negative, but that nothing falls through the cracks, and making sure that this plan meets all of the requirements.
So each of these processes or these meetings that we're having throughout this phase of planning are extremely helpful in many ways. And one way is to pick out and point out the details that need to be worked out, essentially for development to move forward. And so what we've done as a town is we've developed some language, calling it a corporate directive, around managing the conceptual scheme phase. And so essentially, this is a power we haven't necessarily exercised as a municipality prior to now, but there's a gap between ASP phase and subdivision of land. And we have the ability as a town to have another phase of review and requirements on behalf of the developer to lay out more details of the development to move forward. And because of the scale of this development, and because of the temporal scale as well in terms of time frame for build out, we'll be enacting a conceptual scheme phasing for this development. So what we're doing now is we're reviewing the ASP, is we're tying some of these elements that will require more detail to conceptual scheme. And so in order for the developer to move forward beyond conceptual scheme, we will need to see, for instance, all the details worked out for the adaptive management plan. And so we have another point in time following this particular phase of planning to have that checkpoint to work out those details. So where some things might be perceived as falling through the cracks, we have confidence that that will come shortly. And it is something new for the town, but we're looking forward to the opportunity to make sure a lot of these details are worked out prior to any breaking of ground, for instance. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for that, Josh. I don't have anything additional to add.
Any other questions? Ralph, do you have any questions?
Thanks, Bob. No, I don't at this point. No.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, I'm going to make the motion that the committee take the meeting in camera. It's just about 20 to 6. And that's to protect from disclosure information related to recommendations and analysis developed for council in accordance with section 24(1)A of the Freedom of Information Protection Privacy. This time we're going to end the live stream. Thank you all for attending. And the draft minutes and evaluation will be posted in 3 working days. Those in favor? Any opposed? The motion is carried. And we'll now move on to the evaluation discussion. Thank you very much for answering our questions.
Thank
So
you.
Bob, can we just take a short pause here while I stop the live stream?